Welcome everyone to the Golden Echo. It's been a really busy fall for my work, and so as rain sets in and it gets cold, I'm really excited to be able to start doing more conversations with people again. So I've got Cory back with me. We wanted, I wanted to talk with Cory because 2.5 weeks ago, he and I went on a walking pilgrimage in Oklahoma. It's called the Three Hearts Pilgrimage. So it's been around for about 4 or 5 years, and it is, well, it's a walking pilgrimage. It's specifically a walking pilgrimage in honor of the Most Sacred Heart of Jesus, the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and the Most Chaste Heart of Saint Joseph. So it's in honor of the Holy Family, and it ends at a traditional Benedictine monastery that was founded in the 90s in Oklahoma. So very interesting mix of like recent ancient things is how I would put that, right? It's new in the sense that these things kind of just started, especially historically speaking, but they're very, very ancient things to do. It was my second time to go. It was Cory's first time. But it has a let's say it had a lot to do with all of the stuff that we're all trying to work on together. And so I wanted to kind of get a chance to talk with Cory about it. Hilariously, we had a third young man from Chino who showed up, who I hadn't spoken with since the Chino conference. And when I got there, he walked up and said, "Hey, I'm Ted. I'm here." He told me to come, so I'm here. So it was pretty cool. We had like 1.5% of the Chino goers made it to the Three Hearts pilgrimage. But yeah, Cory, so to start with, I just like, man, we're a couple weeks out. You know, let's say the more salient things have had time to cement themselves a little bit more in your mind. I want to just hear what you thought about it, because we never really we haven't talked since then in a way where I've gotten to like hear what you thought about it with a little bit of distance. So
yeah. And it was, I mean, first of all, I appreciate you telling me about it. It was one of those things, and it was timely too, because John Van Donk had given his talk at Chino explicitly about pilgrimage in his John way. So right. It was so awesome. And you told me, I think shortly after that, about this pilgrimage that you were going to be doing. And it kind of captured my imagination, you know, just like a lot of rediscovering traditional Christianity, having been a Protestant my whole life. A lot of it is novelty. A lot of it is definitely a sense of like, oh, you know, this is different. This is new and exciting. But just like you alluded to earlier, I've been very excited about this idea that in our present time, when we're having particular struggles, we're reaching back into the past to find some stuff that has been really given to us, like gifts of God through tradition, through practices, and linking through to the Christians who came before us, the saints before us, and learning to experience God in this new way, but not in a way that's reverting, as if we want to go back in history, but bringing some of that wisdom and some of that beauty forward with us to do cool things, to, you know, redeem us at this time that we kind of desperately need it. So it appealed as an ascetic practice. I've always just enjoyed being outside and hiking anyway, so it was something that appealed to me in that sense. But also this idea of the Three Hearts, it still is. That's one of the weirder devotions to me as a new Catholic. And so it's like, okay, well, maybe this will be my opportunity to really experience it and see what it's all about. And it's the Three Hearts in the context of honoring the family, right? The family as such. So there's and it's all, you start to see how the pattern of the family is the pattern of community, is the pattern of the Holy Family specifically as kind of like the archetypal family. And then also, of course, it's the same pattern in some respects as the Trinity itself. And so there's something very, very deeply fundamental about, you know, kind of spending some time being forced to reflect on it in a community, you know, in the body of Christ. And I've been, you know, really seeking to improve in my own vocation as a father and as a husband, because I've been, you know, it makes it very clear very quickly, the more kids you have, just how selfish you are. You get married, you realize how selfish you are. And then you have a kid, and then you realize how much more selfish you are. And then you have more kids. You're like, oh my goodness, I have not even begun to repent. Like, that's been my experience recently. So it was nice to be able to.
You know, Cory, it's funny. There's almost like a violent confrontation with yourself in those situations. You know, the pilgrimage. Well, okay. So for one thing, right, the pilgrimage is a microcosm of life, of human life, right? Like that's one of the things that really strikes me is
human life is a pilgrimage. That's right.
Exactly. Right. And so in the same way, you know, I bring this up all the time about narrative, like about stories, is that what they do is they take our life is a story, but we're in the middle of it. And so how do you know what the story means in the middle of it? And it's like, that's really tough. And so we do these sort of rehearsals, right? We read these stories and we go over them. And we're like, I'm in the middle. And it's that going over and over in a compressed manner, because you can tell a story, a coherent narrative about someone's life, fictional or otherwise, in 20 minutes. You can read it, or maybe longer. It might be something you read over the course of weeks or months, but you can do that many times in your life, right? And so the pilgrimage it's your whole life in a couple of days, right? For a short walking pilgrimage like this, like you're rehearsing your whole life. And when you think about it in those terms, I think that actually goes down quite a ways. So for instance, you start out and you're like, you don't know where you're going, but you follow after people who do know where they're going, right? So you're following people with these, like, who, on this faith that you're going to get somewhere, and you start out and you're like excited and fresh and everything's really new. And like the sun comes up and it's, wow, look at all of this. And like, as the pilgrimage goes on, it's like it becomes harder and harder to have that same sort of fresh new outlook, let's say, on what's going on. And like, you've been walking for miles and miles and miles, and they're kind of the same. And so your whole approach to it starts to shift, well, towards the end, for one thing, right? At least for me, like this first day, so it's 23 miles the first day. And like, it hurt like the absolute dickens for me for the last, I don't know how many miles. Cory, you were being so gracious trying to tell me stories to get through it. It was so bad. There's a couple of stories where I was like, okay, it's a day later. I'm not in brutal pain. Can you please tell me that story again? Because it was a good story and I'd like to hear it and appreciate it. But there's this sort of like turning inward at the same time as you look towards the end. And then if you think about sort of the whole narrative of it, that we end up right at this monastery, which, both as Catholics, we see it as sort of this particular embodiment of the eschaton, right? So I remember earlier this year, I was there on a little visit, and was talking with one of the brothers. Oh no, he's a priest. So one of the Benedictine fathers there he was working at the gatehouse, and we're just chatting. He's like, we Benedictines try to live the angelic life. And so there's this very, very much the sense that like the monastery is in some sense patterned after heaven. And if you think about that a lot, that'll help things like the Divine Comedy make more sense to you, and monasteries make more sense. But we get there, and then there's this grand pontifical high mass where a cardinal comes, and it's just like, dude, everyone's decked out. They've got this unbelievable men's scola there to sing the mass. And the sense of like having God, and you have that, and then you have a feast. You sit down, you have a feast. Wow, this is so weird, man. I'm like, this is straight up the Book of Revelation, like as a microcosm. And then you sit down, you all have a feast, and you're all like, you're done. Like, you're done. You don't have to walk anymore. And I think there's like so much value in doing that, so that you have faith that when you walk through the hard things in life that aren't, say, in this constrained, artificial in the best, in the appropriate sense, like people came together to create this experience, this thing that we're doing together, so that when you then have these, it's like, I knew I had 23 miles left on that first day, and I had some vague memory of how far away the campground was. And so like, even though I was like, it hurt really bad, it's like, I'm going to go because I know I know at the end I'm going to get there. Like if I just but if you don't know that you're going to get there, it's like, why keep walking? Honestly, like really, really, why keep walking? And then you look at Canada and, and they're like medical assistance in death. And you're like, yeah, no wonder they're just like, yeah, we'll just let you stop walking. Like you don't want to keep walking. That's fine. Like here you go. Just like sit down on the side of the road. Yeah, at any rate, I agree. So it's a sort of a violent confrontation with my own weakness as a person. When I put myself in that situation, I realize, say, how wedded I am to comfort. Or, the funny thing, I don't know, I'd be curious to hear how you felt about this. We're pretty much in the back of the line again. And dude, it drives me crazy to be at the back of the line. There's over 2,000 people there. And like, you're never, we didn't get in the church. We didn't get to be in the church at high mass. Like we're just like out in the grass, with like a speaker system.
And I'm glad you
was
brought
that hard
up because, dude, that's exactly one of the things that I wanted to talk about and I'm glad that you described it as, I didn't think to put the entire pilgrimage in terms of that is a microcosm of life. And that was 100% my experience. Like at the beginning, there's always a sense of anticipation. Or no, that's not right. At the beginning, there's a sense of anticipation, but you have no clue what you're getting into. And it's interesting to contrast the fact that you've done this before. You have a little bit more experience with the pattern, so to speak. I'm getting there. I literally knew nobody out of the 2,000 plus people there except for you.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah. You were the only person in that crowd that I knew. So I show up with almost, I know we're going to walk a lot and I know it's going to hurt and I'm excited. And that's all I know. Yeah. And you get going and towards the middle, just like you said, at some point it just becomes drudgery. And it's just because it is explicitly an ascetic practice, it is so wonderful to be forced internal. And then as that happens, you're reminded by that pain, by the being forced internal. And when I say internal, like, you start to just ignore everything going on around you. Yeah. It focuses your attention, or it gives you the opportunity to refocus your attention over and over and over and over again on why am I here? Why did I come to do this? And then you remember, oh yeah, what I'm trying to honor my family. I'm doing this to pray for my family. I'm doing this to seek penance for myself. I'm doing this to become a better father and a better husband. Ultimately, I'm doing this to the glory of God. And I don't think I have prayed continuously that long ever in my life before, which is not nothing, right? Like to the Protestants to say, okay, this is a weird tradition that's like, you don't need this. You don't need penance to experience the grace of God. And that's true. But like, I spent 2 days straight pretty much praying continually. And that is not nothing. Like that was so, but then you get through towards the end. I'm also going to say that there was a lot of weeping. There's a lot of weeping during that weekend. And it was all joyful weeping. It was not like, yes, in great pain, but especially once you go through so I'll describe it for the people, right? You show up after having done 23 miles on the first day and then 12-ish miles on the second day. And then you arrive at the gates of the monastery land. And there's about a mile to go from that point to actually walk through the land to arrive at the monastery itself, the building. And they told us that the whole time prior to that point, we were, singing and praying out loud and talking and whatever else. That last mile on the monastery land was conducted in dead silence. We were in the back of the column. So our little chapter was almost the very last. I think we were the very last in line by the time we got there because people were kind of jostling a little bit. Yeah. And I had to restrain myself from wanting to get ahead and like pass people. But it was so perfect because let me describe some of the things that I saw during that last mile. I'm going to get emotional again just thinking about it. So 2,000 plus people in a column in front of us, all strung out with flags and banners billowing in the wind. Dead silence, everybody walking, everybody not walking very well, like kind of limping. And like some people, okay, so this is a topic I want to come back to, but there was not a small number of young people who did the entire thing barefoot, right? So this is blasted into my memory forever.
Yeah.
I look next to me as we're walking along, and I see he's probably like a college age young man, who had done this whole thing barefoot, and there are bloody bandages falling off of his feet, and he's being supported on either side by his brothers, who are helping him hobble slowly along. And just like I'm literally seeing visions of in real life of sanctification and beautiful redemption happening right in front of me as I'm watching these two young men carry their brother. And I see parents carrying their children, and it's quiet. Like everybody was so quiet, and it's a beautiful land. Then you arrive at the point where the creek is, and there's kind of like a valley that the creek runs, pretty steep valley that the road runs right through. And you arrive at the lip as you're about to go down into the creek, and the monastery is through the trees on the other side. As you approach the lip, suddenly you could hear the bells tolling, calling this column of 2,000 people forward towards the worship of God, like fully embodied intentionally after the pattern of Revelation. And like I'd already lost it like three times at this point. I think I was like, at some point I just stopped trying to wipe my eyes. And then you go down into the valley, and you're climbing up across the creek on the other side of the valley, and you can still hear the bells, and you hear the bagpipes.
Oh man,
piping us forward. And then as you go up and you reach the edge, climbing out of the valley, the column kind of goes around the bend, and you see the banners and the people and the bells calling them forward into this beautiful church building, calling them forward to worship God all together, all 2,000 of us. And then we got forward, and then we had to stand there, which was honestly more painful than the walking at some point. Yes. For like 20 minutes for people to slowly fill the church. And they've got more people in there than I expected. But you said we didn't make it inside. I never actually saw the inside of the sanctuary. I didn't get to see it afterwards either. And I was thinking like, what? I was bummed about that. But then I was thinking, there's something worth reflecting on about that. Because the kingdom of God and the way it will be at the end, it's not going to be all the same experience for everybody necessarily. I don't know how to make sense of that yet. And I've only begun to process it. So I'm curious to know what you think too. But to me, it was part of the healthy humbling of the experience, to recognize that I was somebody who was still present and still participating and still oriented in worshiping the Lord, but I was still on the outside in some respect. And there was a definite hierarchy of nearness to the altar where Cardinal Burke was offering the Mass. And then those of us who had to be outside, and then further back, there were people who didn't even get chairs. We were just, sitting and kneeling in the grass out there.
Yeah.
And it was very, very immediate. It's never been so obvious to me how the Divine Liturgy is a picture of the eschaton. And the glory, the fact that we were outside did not by one iota detract from the beauty of that experience, and just my total just awe at being allowed to be present for it.
Yeah. So I mean, there's that fires off a bunch of things in my head. It's sort of there's two things. One, I mean, today being the Feast of All Saints is great, right? So because there's this already not yetness, right? And so like the fact that we don't even, we're just like stuck out on the grass is like, yeah, that's right. Like I'm not dead, right? This is all still a matter of this, of living out right, like living rightly on this earth, which is ascetical and, as Peugeot pointed out, and full of disappointments, like good disappointment, right? And so I would say that like one of the things that strikes me is like that's good disappointment, because because that isn't actually the end. It's a picture or an echo the end, but it isn't the end of all things. And so like it can actually be very helpful. This is part of asceticism, is the reminder, right, that this isn't where everything ends, that it's all a preparation. So that was one thing that I thought about. And so yeah, there's this sense like we're all on the doorstep, and there's the church in heaven, and like that's where we're headed, but we're not there yet. And so I mean, that's actually be a great comfort to us, right? Because of the travails and the sorrows of this life, as good as it is, like, thank God this isn't all we get. C.S. Lewis has got this great quote in one of his essays in God on the Dock, where he says something to the effect of, if this world is supposed to be heaven, then it's a hellish prison. But if this world is like a prison or like a hospital on our way somewhere, then it is a hospital that is full of light and beautiful views and like good and friendly people. Mm-hmm. And so the weird sense in which you would think that it would be a pessimistic view to take, to say, yeah, this is the valley of tears. But actually that's maybe the best way to experience happiness in this life, is to accept it as the valley of tears. And then all of a sudden it gives you the chance to actually experience the blessings of it. I also think about Charles Williams' dictum, this also is thou, neither is this thou, right? So this is how we live in a world of symbols, right? That God, all things speak of God and none of them are God, would be one way to say it. And so
that's good.
But there's this weird sort of duality to it, where the more, let's say, a thing approximates the divine, the easier it is to confuse with the divine often. And so there is a blessing. This is the whole Sermon on the Mount, or the Beatitudes, right? Like, blessed are the poor in spirit. Well, how could that possibly be? Like, that sounds like you're further from God if you're poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn. The notion there is that there's this, when in this earthly life, you're taken further from maybe the things that your heart longs for, you have the opportunity to see that the only real rest is in God. And so to be, let's say, stuck outside of the church building, as we were, there's this chance to turn even more towards like what we're actually headed for, rather than say the full earthly fulfillment of like, oh, I had this really cool experience on pilgrimage, right? Because there's a sense like in which
that's right.
The more it's about the experience, the worse it is for your soul, and the less it is about the experience, like the more for the health of your soul it is. And so there's this very real sense in which it's like, yeah, it's good that like the girls in the tent next to us talked until like some who knows what hour of the night on the first night, and and that it rained on us, and that like and like whatever, all these things. It's like, and to me that was both years. That was, although there's some interesting nuance to the second year, but especially the first year that I went. Which, Cory, the first year it was the same thing. I knew no one. I didn't know anyone. I didn't know anyone at all. It was really weird. I was like, I came back and it was like, it felt like a family reunion. First, because like the trad Catholic circle in this part of the country is like not huge, and so you're just like going around. And it's like I regularly show up at various parishes in the area, and so it was very weird the second year. And then we had a chapter from our parish. You were there. I had some family and some friends that were with me. But the first year, there was this, every time those disappointing things happened. So like the first year, I forgot a sleeping pad, right, and so just like on the hard ground. and it's like there's this thing about how we get angry when we're disappointed. And when you're on pilgrimage, it is easier, it's not guaranteed, but it's easier to look at those hardships and say, you know what, like I actually came for this, like
that's right,
this is why I'm here. And then all of a sudden, like, it gives you the opportunity to be blessed by those hardships and those disappointments and all of those things. Now, here's the wild thing. Here's the wild, scary thing, is that there's no like actual reason that you couldn't live your entire life like that. The only reason that you don't live your entire life like that is because of sin, right? So this is the weird thing again, right? It's like, if you will embrace your brokenness and turn towards redemption, then you have the best shot at actually being happy. Like, it's like, right, it's like our Lord says, whoever tries to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will save it. there's this thing about like when you embrace hardship in that way, and there's plenty of nuance to this, and this is why it's like a thing to be done under the spiritual authority of someone else, because like you can go off the rails with this stuff, and there's Ted's disclaimer, but like getting back on the like asceticism is important thing. It's like I actually think that happiness is impossible without asceticism, and I'm actually going to take it a step further. One of the thoughts that came to me out of the pilgrimage is that I don't think that sanity is possible without asceticism. Okay.
You know what? I think you're really onto something there. Flesh that out a little bit.
Yeah. So it's easy to see in the negative, I think, pretty quickly, right? You're like, imagine a person who, the moment something stirred in them, right, towards something, an appetite or desire, that they had it. Imagine trying to have a conversation with that person. What would you talk to them about? Like, is there anything to? And it's not. Here's what's weird though. It's not like we just talk about what we want all the time, and therefore we're able to have conversations, and this sort of like weird, like, we're driven to each other by economic need. No. It's actually that it's in the place between desire and fulfillment that we like exist as people. And so if you don't order your desires in any sense, now, through most of history, this is the weird thing, through most of history, there were just like hard physical limits on what you could get a hold of, right? Like there's only so much food, if you want to indulge in sexual gratification, there's basically people in like, it's like access to whatever materials, like pretty limited, having power over other people intrinsically, that's limited to a very few people. We're opening up this world. The whole project of this sort of transhumanist techno-utopia thing is exactly this, that no desire should ever go unfulfilled. And I'm looking at this now and I think, well, not only is that bad on the level of moral formation, it's actually bad in the fact that it drives people insane. Like, people actually go insane. And so thinking about that as people who live in this era of hyperabundance in the sense of what's think about this in your own life, right? Okay, get on the computer. If you want to see this, get on YouTube and just like click on whatever draws your attention the moment it draws your attention. Where are you in 45 minutes? Like, stand up and like try to have a conversation with someone. You can't. Like, it actually drives you crazy. So it's in that process of having because the old sort of Western Thomistic notion, right, is that you have, and I don't know how much this is Aristotelian, but certainly Thomistic. You have your intellect, you have your appetites, right, and then you have your will. And the appropriate order is that your intellect operates in your desires through the will, right? So your will orders your desires, and your will is guided by the intellect, right? So you could call that like, the mind, will, and emotion is what we would call it now, right? But the notion is that when the fall of Adam, right? The fall, the passions, the emotions, the desires ended up taking. They're now they override the intellect, and so you can't. That's why it's so hard when you can know, oh, I shouldn't eat that, I shouldn't look at that, I shouldn't say that, and then you do it anyway. You're like, but I knew, like rationally or intellectually, like I knew I shouldn't have done that. Why did I do it? It's like that's what like the Western theologians point out. They're like, that's original sin. Like what you're looking at, that's concupiscence. That's disordered desire. And so the notion of grace is that it enlightens the intellect, strengthens the will, and orders the appetites, right? So grace moves you back towards that. But even on a natural level, you have the capacity. I mean, this should be like, when I say this, it almost sounds tautological, but it's like, it's so obvious to see that. Like, how does someone learn? They learn not by being driven by whatever they want all the time and just like following after squirrels or porn or whatever. People become knowledgeable by narrowing their attention, giving things up, right? There's this sense of giving up. Again, I love Pajot's give up, right? That's how anything, like you look, language is and I don't want to blow this. There's a specific category of religious asceticism, but I'm not trying to erode the notion of fasting, almsgiving, and prayer. That's like in Christianity and I think Islam, like that's asceticism right there, those three. But the broader sense of asceticism of training your desires, right? Language could be viewed as a form of asceticism because you're giving up your idiosyncratic ways of communication and all the possible ways that you can talk to engage in this sort of common inherited means of communication. This is my point. If you don't get order either externally or internally, then you don't exist as a coherent person. You're not sane, and you can't be in relationship to anyone or anything. And so that didn't used to be that much of a problem, although it always has been. I think it's increasingly there's increasingly a need to do things like go on a pilgrimage. And so, Cory, you were bringing up these young men, these high school boys who were walking barefoot, which, by the way, like a third of it's gravel roads. It's not like we're walking on concrete sidewalks, like rough country roads. A lot of it's dirt gravel roads. So
the second I started to take a little bit of pride in the pain that I was feeling in my feet wearing nice boots, I look over and I'm like, oh wow. I have not been so inspired. I don't remember the last time I was so inspired as I was by some of the young people that I saw on that pilgrimage. Young people.
And just
am I old for saying that?
What'd you say?
Young people. Am I old for saying that? Sorry.
No. Yeah. Look, you're solidly into parenthood and into this, you're in a different stage of life from like an 18-year-old boy. There's a degree of
the proper definition of middle age is moving from singlehood to having kids.
There you go.
I think once you have kids, you're in middle age. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing.
Absolutely. Midway through this life's I it's like you and I I was 35. Like we're not that far off from that. So, which by the way, just because I like throwing this in, speaking of aging and all this notion, there's one of Dante's earlier works. I can't remember if I think it's the Vita Nuova. But he talks about, he breaks up life into these various stages, like 5 stages of life. And it's the second to last one. And he says that the people who have reached this stage, it's basically like grandparent stage, right? You're not like falling to pieces. You're not like decrepit, but you're old, but you're still like very much engaged with life. He says that the people who are that old ought to have many great and wonderful things to tell for their long life. Mm. And I remember reading that one 6 or 7 years ago and thinking like, that's a good goal. So you're talking about these young men. I remember last year walking into the monastery, this guy that I met he was in the same group as me. He had several children with him, and some of them had they started getting some stress injuries in their legs, and so the medical staff was like, yeah, they can't walk anymore, but they're dead set on finishing the pilgrimage. So my friend Matt has got his 2 or 3 year old baby girl in the front carrier, and then he's got his 8-9-year-old son in a fireman's carry on his shoulders. And I walked all the way in with him like that. And I just thought you brought up this whole thing of it being, connected with family and especially for us and in the life that we're living, the particular vocation of fatherhood, and looking at him and thinking, yeah, okay, I can see it right here, that he's making that last, 1.5 mile walk in. And Wade, you could look at, this is the whole shift. This is the whole paradigm shift. Weighed down, burdened by his children. Is that really what it is? Because when I look over at him, I don't think, what a crushed man who needs to be liberated from this. I think that is that's breathtakingly admirable.
It's his glory. It's literally his glory.
Yeah.
To bear that weight for his kids. So much of the stuff that you said before, I'm gonna try to because you're saying it with a different language, but so much of it is leading into so I'm gonna try to you have a much better background in the Thomistic philosophy and the technical terminology, but it's I keep thinking when you talk about how it can literally make you insane when you just seek comfort endlessly, right? That's exactly what I was talking about with Ken Lowry. there's a sense in which we abstract ourselves so completely from reality by seeking comfort. And the more power that we have to create a comfortable environment for us. It's also the same as the essay that I showed you on public transportation, right? It is openness to real complexity. Like I'll try to use more of the, I'm more comfortable with Vervaeke type language, so I'll just riff on that.
Well, and his notion of
like complexity and like, yeah, exactly. So, but if you have it's about your posture, right? Like it's your stance. And I've been reflecting on the question recently. Well, I've been thinking about beauty and suffering and how the two relate, because I think the two are so tightly related that you're almost tempted to say they're the same thing. I don't think they're not the same thing, but like there's a way in which, and so I asked the question, how does a saint perceive suffering? Right? Like exactly what you were saying before, if you had the imaginal worldview, if you had the posture, if you were a saint, you saw things the way that God saw them to the best that we're able to as a human being. Suffering is not suffering. It's not a thing that it becomes transfigured. It actually becomes the most beautiful thing. The worst suffering that you can imagine, when it is redeemed, becomes the most beautiful thing that you can possibly imagine. Right. And what we were doing on this pilgrimage, as we're allowing, like, it's not seeking suffering for its own sake, right? It's not flagellation. It's not self-flagellation.
Right.
But it's an openness. It's a posture towards real inconvenience, real uncertainty and complexity, not shying away from something just because it hurts or because it's uncomfortable. That's training. That is actually training our imagination. Like it's, and when you talk about like, you know, imagination and will, like the two are, your will derives from your imaginal preferences, from your worldview, and also your will, like it's not just one way. Will also shapes what your imagination is, because you have the ability. It's a very, you know, that's something that we need to flesh out some more, because there's a dynamic reciprocity to that, right? It's a loop. Like your imagination shapes your will in a way that you almost can't control, and your will also has the ability to shape your imagination. So
well,
like this,
undoubtedly, your will, because your will leads you into these things that then inform your imagination, right? They give form to your imagination, the experience.
Right. So you were talking about how you intentionally narrow your attention onto something, but it's the crazy thing that happens, you know, when those who lose their lives will save it.
Yeah.
You narrow your attention to the proper thing, to the highest thing, to really, it's to Christ himself. What you actually experience is a rapid expansion of your ability to perceive everything. Like it's the meditations on a tool shed, right? It's moving from contemplating, looking at the beam of light, moving to looking in the beam of light and seeing everything else through that same light. Like this kind of ascetic practice is literally a training ground to be able to like you said, have this kind of posture, hopefully more and more in the rest of our lives, so that we don't have this, and the focus becomes different to where the language has to just completely change. We don't care about suffering. Like, not that we don't, you know, like the entire ordered principle of your life by which you see everything else is simply Christ. It's simply Christ, and seeking him more and more. And then whatever suffering you experience is perceived differently and becomes beautiful. And that actually can lead to happiness, is like, you know, not even a secondary good. That's like a tertiary good that gets thrown in along with the rest of it, right?
Yeah. Well, you know, so there's several things. One is the Father Jeremy Lee Hopkins poem is Kingfishers Catch Fire, which ends by saying, I say more, the just man justices keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces, acts out in God's eyes what in God's eyes he is, Christ. For Christ shines in 10,000 places, lovely in eyes and lovely in limbs not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Now, I mean, that's exactly what you're saying, right? This, if you look at the right thing, then you can see everything through that, right? This is the, let's say, the lower version of the beatific vision, which is the notion that which is the doctrine that when we are united to God in heaven, or even before the resurrection, that we will see him through no intermediary thing, and in seeing him we will see all things, right? So there's a vision of you will never take your eyes off of God, and yet you'll see everything, right? Like, because you're looking at him. And I don't know if the last conversation I had with Nate and Sherry on the Divine Comedy, I was trying to bring up this Khalil Gibran poem, which we talked about the circle of the gluttonous, which, let's say, has, especially those earlier sins, they have very obvious connections with these sort of liturgical asceticism, with prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. So I finally dug up the poem by Khalil Gibran. It's on houses, and I think that this passage is just like, oh, there's so much here for us. He says, "Tell me, have you these in your houses, or have you only comfort and the lust for comfort, that stealthy thing that enters the house as a guest and then becomes a host and then a master? Aye, and it becomes a tamer, and with hook and scourge makes puppet of your larger desires. Though its hands are silken, its heart is of iron. It lulls you to sleep only to stand by your bed and jeer at the dignity of the flesh. It makes mock of your sound senses and lays them in thistledown like fragile vessels. Verily, the lust for comfort murders the passion of the soul and then walks grinning to the funeral."
Yeah, please bring that to Convivium. That's perfect. You know why that's perfect? That's like, so this is why this is so correct for this pilgrimage to be about the family, right? Because I've also been reading a lot about how, oh man, liturgical asceticism, it just suddenly clicked for me what that actually means, because I didn't really realize what that means now. Like, it is asceticism as your liturgy. I was thinking the other way around. I was thinking like liturgy.
It's both.
It is both, but
yes.
So like that is your work. That is your service. That is your proper worship, right? Like in Romans 12.
Yes.
Which I think I said earlier that liturgia is in Romans 12, and it's not. I was really disappointed to find that out, but it's still the same concept, I think, right? Like,
but good on
the liturgy of your life. Yeah. Well, the proper orderedness of our life is it becomes properly ordered by these ascetic practices, and in the home. So I'm learning about how, not learning isn't even the right word. It's being revealed to me how the home is the exact same pattern as what you were talking about at the very beginning. Like, it is the monastery. It is supposed to be understood as like Rivendell. It's supposed to be understood as a little picture of the eschaton, of heaven, of the heavenly city, Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem. Like, it is the place that you can, like, as living in this way in obedience to Christ, actually, like, literally in the material sense, shapes our environment, and relationally, like our relationships amongst each other, between, in a home, parent and child and husband and wife. It shapes that so that environment, not just metaphorically, but the physical enclosure of the home itself becomes a little slice of the kingdom of heaven that you can then invite other people into. It becomes a place of safety and redemption and
shalom.
and proper shalom. And it's a space that allows a child, for example, to most fully become what they are, because they have simultaneously the freedom and exactly the right kind of limitation in that structure to become fully expressed. And it's a thing that you can invite outsiders into to experience healing, who've never seen anything like that before. This is also kind of the pattern that we're seeking after with Estuary, I think. Like, that creates a metaphorical space of discussion. That's the same thing. It's there, and this is the thing that we struggle with in the group, is like, well, where are the limits and what should the restrictions be? And there has to be some kind of formality to it. And yet it's like total openness. How do you balance these two seeming extreme opposites? But that's exactly it. It's there, contained in Christ, in truth and love. And it's we're learning to experience and enjoy the kingdom of heaven. And in so doing, by continuing to be obedient as we go out from these ascetic, like a pilgrimage or from visiting a monastery, by carrying it with you, your environment is shaped by your behavior to actually become the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
And
well, look, that was exactly the experience that I had the first time I went to to Clear Creek Abbey. I wasn't even Catholic yet, and it was in late November 2 years ago. Man, it feels like a decade ago. But we drove up, and it's like, well, when you're just driving on the back roads of Oklahoma, and looks like, peasant pastures and wild woods, and then it's like all of a sudden you're like, oh, those woods are kind of like, they look more like orderly and like they look like they're headed where they're supposed to be. And then you turn the corner and you're like, oh, that's because it's monastery land. And then you're driving down the pastures that we walked on, and then you go down the bridge, and then there's like the wheat fields and the vegetable garden, and then you go up further, and it's like there's the vineyard, right? And then there's the church, then there's like the lawn running up, and the church and the monastery buildings. And then you go in, and there are these orderings towards the high altar, where there's, and then there's the consecrated host. There's our Lord and the Blessed Sacrament of the Eucharist. And at the consecration, at the moment of the consecration, they ring the bells in the church, but they also ring the church bells, and it goes out into the countryside. And
those are some big bells too. They were loud.
Those are some big bells. Yeah. So there's a friend of mine out there. I've done some work.
Oh, that's so cool.
Like 3 or 4 miles away. And if you're quiet at night, you can hear the bells when they're ringing for the divine office, for praying the hours. You'd just be outside.
That's the music of redemption. That's like literally the music of creation being flung out over the wilderness from and so then, the instantiation of Christ.
God gives himself to everyone there, right? To all the faithful, and they participate in communion, and then they go out, right? Like each one is, in the sense of church, like a church building, like each one of them is like a little church, and they go out, and that's exactly right. And my friend Brandon, who does butchering, he likes to say, because he's in the small scale regenerative ag homesteading world, and it's like, people ask him, like, what's the best thing I can do to be a better farmer? And depending on how cheeky he's feeling, he'll be like, go to mass. If you want to be a better farmer, go to mass.
That's right.
But his point is exactly what you're saying, Cory. It's that we draw these separating lines in this stuff that's not there, right? As if the way that we spend our time on Sunday, the person, like the God that we kneel down before, as though that has no bearing on the way that we construct our houses and feed our families and talk to people and arrange the furniture in our house and drive our car, and on and on and on and on and on. And it's like, the incarnation should make this absurdly clear that those boundaries have been forever and completely broken down. And this is the picture that I have, the image that I have for my YouTube channel, the Golden Echo. It's an icon of the Holy Family. As you brought up, right, the notion, the Catholic notion that the Holy Family is this image of the Trinity. In fact, not only is it an image of the Trinity, it's the clearest image of the Trinity on earth. And I think about Jonathan Pageau's cosmic garden icon, and he's got the Garden of Eden going up, and then he's got the heavenly spheres around Christ crucified, and there's this overlap right there, where the heavens and the earth overlap, and that's Eden. And you have Christ and the Blessed Virgin and St. John at the foot of the cross. But that's what the family is supposed to be. And I know there's a lot of people have had crummy families and they've been hurt, and it's hard to see salvation or goodness in that. And I would say 100%. But I would quote C.S. Lewis again, being the good young, early 21st century Protestant that I was, that the better a thing is, the worse it is when it's fallen, right? The more harm it does. He says a bad dog can do so much damage. A bad man can do far more damage, and a bad angel unspeakable. And so this notion of the family as a vessel of redemption, and as, let's say, the place, one of the Venn diagrams of heaven and earth when it's properly instantiated, I would say the damage that family can do to people when it's messed up and corrupt and pathological and broken is an indication of its capacity for goodness when it's redeemed. And so, it's like you and I as fathers, it's like we've got one part of that puzzle. Although Sherry, goodness, last time we were talking, Sherry read this quote about this. It was something like, there's no bad mothers. There's only bad husbands and fathers, because mothers are mirrors of the men in their lives. It's like, oh, dang.
Whoa.
I don't know if I agree with that 100%, but like that well, because then you take it up a level to the mother of God, and it's like, well, who's she a mirror of, right? She's the perfect mirror. And when you pray the litany of the Blessed Virgin Mary, right, she's actually described as a mirror in at least one of her titles. But the notion that the family is something worth dying for, and so we got to go on this little pilgrimage as a little way to, like, as fathers, to seek to bring that about a little bit more, that like we would imitate Saint Joseph, that we would imitate God the Father, that there's this, Dr. Kudebeck, who spoke there, he had that wonderful thing where he's like, in terms of like calling, and he says he's, and I agree with this, I've heard this many times, that all men are called to fatherhood, right? Because his definition of fatherhood, speaking of babies, speaking of his notion of fatherhood is not, say, merely to engender, to beget a child on the biological level, but to craft virtue in another.
That's right.
And so
that's right. And that's Jordan Peterson's point about how the most meaningful thing you can do is pour your life into somebody who's coming along behind you, like being a teacher, being a father figure. In some, there's a reason we call priests father. And this pattern is, teachers. It's everybody who sees the value in somebody farther along behind them and sacrificially pours their life out into helping them along and towards building virtue. Like that was, I loved listening to Dr. Kudebeck. I'm still mulling all that stuff over.
Yeah. So that notion that we're, as men, like we are called to fatherhood. And it's like, I would say, thinking back on that there is no more, well, to teach virtue, you have to have it. So the call, as all men is, there's literally nothing more important that you could be doing than cultivating virtue in yourself and then in those around you that you have, within your sphere of existence of influence.
Yeah. And it's worth it to anchor on, to teach. We think about teaching virtue, and we have an idea of what teach means in this didactic sense, right? How do we actually properly teach virtue? Like it's not a thing that you make a PowerPoint and like stand in front of a classroom, right? Like
that's right.
It is a mentorship. It is a coaching. It is Vervaeke talks about that too. I can't remember the words that he uses specifically, but this is a thing that's relational. And in parenthood, this is again the best example of it, but it's also true. Like you see this in things like military leadership. You see this in political leadership. You see this in like even in like teaching and educational spheres. In its best sense is when the teacher can supersede the idea of the didactic teaching and really embody the virtues that they're trying to teach, because virtues are caught. A child or a younger person or all human beings is actually the way that we work. This is again, back to the imagination. We absorb the things from the environment that we're in. And by environment here, I mean the people that we're around, the cultural environment, the social environment, right? Like you become like the people that you are around, and your family is the most concentrated version of that. So the father, as goes the father, so goes the family. I think that's right. And it's not like you have to tell your children this is what virtue is and you should do this and don't do this. You can do that all day, but if you're not living it, are they going to imitate what you say? No, they're going to do exactly what you do. And that's like, I'm preaching to myself so hard right now, because There's a reason that marriage and like parenthood is sacramental, right? This is the point at which God's grace changes us.
Yeah. Well, and again, to your point, like it is, I'm really liking that language. Like it is a violent confrontation with your own shortcomings, right?
It breaks part of you. It actually breaks part of you.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I remember that like our youngest or our second youngest had very serious health problems for the first 7 months of her life. And like, I just got ground into the dirt dealing with that. Like to the point that there were periods of it that I could not remember, months of that time that I couldn't remember until way down the road. It was like, what happened in May? I don't know. Like I actually can't remember a single day in May. But what happened is that like it also totally transformed me as a person, and I like especially the virtue of self-control. So there's just a lot of like like around the clock care, the kind of thing where it's like you're up at 2 in the morning and at 4 in the morning and at 6 in the morning, and you have to be awake. One of us has to be awake for about 40 minutes, like paying attention to what we're doing. And you just like someone had to do it every single time, and it just and it's that's the kind of asceticism that's forced on us, and like the concern that we live, as we are in an increasingly technologically comfortable society, is that those opportunities will happen to us less and less, right? What's the old thing? Hard times make good people, no, hard times make strong people make good times.
Men, yeah.
Good men make good, strong men make good times make weak men make bad times. And there is actually, I don't know if that's like, there's a way to avoid that societally, but on an individual level, like the call to asceticism is the call to step out of that and say that like in spite of whatever ease there may be in my life, like I'm going to follow this call to virtue and to seek that in these ways. And that like, that's what you and I did with the pilgrimage. And there's like some cool, like, oh, wonderful, like interesting experience of doing this. And it feels kind of like a road race or an adventure race or something like that. But like at the end of the day, that's what it's about. It's about getting up and going and doing this thing for the sake of the cultivation of virtue and righteousness in our own lives, and because of like as husbands and fathers. But even if we weren't married with kids, like it would still matter that we cultivated that stuff, those virtues in ourselves, because we're not alone. And
that's right. And whether or not you're sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, you have no idea where those seeds end up. Like, you just don't. Like, this is the point. Like, and this is the reason that I'm always on Job, because like you don't know what the end of the story looks like, and so until you've walked the whole thing, you have no what you die. The meaning of your actions is derived from the future. Like, this is the thing. This is why consequentialism is such as just like unreal, because you can't know what your actions lead to, and so you can't make decisions based on what they lead to, and so you have to choose virtue and wisdom. Like, there isn't another choice. Like, making calculated consequentialist decisions doesn't work, even on its own terms. That's what I'm trying to say. And so, like, it doesn't matter who you are. Like, virtue is, by definition, virtue is the right choice.
Yeah, and what? How is it that's so? It's we want to be careful with that too, because the language that we're using is we like the ideas, we like the words, we like the thinky-talky stuff, and it's easy to get lost in that. But what is it like in its most fundamental sense, in the sense that this is what the Protestants often boil it down to, and there's a sense in which they're right. What is that? It's obedience.
Yes.
It's doing the thing that Jesus told us to do, like do the thing. Does that require understanding? Does that require like knowing the words that what he's teaching us to do is build virtue, to build wisdom, to have all the different names for all the different types, to understand what's happening to us when we're obeying? No. And in fact, it's usually a stumbling block to understand those things.
Well, but my one caveat to that, Cory, is unless you're the kind of person that has those natural capacities, in which case to neglect them is terrible. So like, I can't get away with, because of like,
sure. Yeah.
My brain would be spinning on something else. So it's like, because I have this kind of brain, this kind of mind, it's like, I have to. But
absolutely. I don't want to take away from that. But nevertheless, like the operating principle there is that you're being obedient rather than
Yes.
like being able to use the proper words and understand how they all connect together in the abstract sense, right?
Absolutely.
Like
And this goes back to
and
church.
the way that that's expressed in both of us has to
Yes.
be, you know, there
Yeah.
has to be the abstraction, because otherwise,
This goes,
you
but
know,
this goes back to the church. You know, it's like, is it a greater service to God to have been, you know, up at the high altar as one of the altar servers there, or to be out in the grass? And it's like the only thing that matters there is the degree of obedience of the soul. It doesn't matter if you're out in the grass outside the church building, or if you're like at the high altar. Those are earthly hierarchies to draw out a picture. There's another much more important hierarchy, which is the degree to which your soul is submitted to God. And that there is no relationship between that and your intellect. In fact, it's possible that it's more dangerous to have, there's just different dangers if you have a very active intellect versus a more
But there's
quiet.
there's a reason that like the poor are more blessed than the rich. Like the rich should take pride in their low position, right? Like it's the same kind of idea.
Yeah.
There are more pitfalls available to you, the more you can spiral off on the wrong thing. The more you exist in like a type of poverty, whatever type of poverty it is, the more you exist closer to the realities of the finitude of life, the more opportunities you have to see the reality of life. You're not going to spend time abstracting off in ways that are subtly wrong if you're fighting to get your family's next meal, right? Like you're embodying the patterns whether you want to or not, or else you die. And so there is a real truth to, like, you know, whether you're talking about ideas or actual wealth, you know, material wealth. But anyway, that's
it's just like, it's the weird blessing of necessity that I don't wish on anyone, and yet everyone needs. Like, it's not my job to make sure that anyone is in a place of necessity, you know. In fact, it's my job to keep them from it as much as I can. And yet, so it's
and that's a good thing, right? It's a weird paradox.
It is a weird paradox.
I'm gonna have to get going here in just a minute, I think.
But, so thanks, Cory. It was really great having you along on the pilgrimage. I'm looking forward to seeing you down here again pretty soon for Convivium. It's going to be a different kind of thing from the pilgrimage. It's going to be more, there's going to be more enjoyment in it. Hopefully it will be, you know, also deeply edifying. Help us on our way as fathers and husbands. But yes, duty calls, get after it. Happy All Saints Day. And thanks for coming on with me.
Thanks for inviting me to the pilgrimage. I hope I'll maybe see you again at it next year and drag a few more people along with me. And very excited for Convivium. I think it's going to be a really great little group of people.
It's going to be a really good crew. I'm surprised. I'm quite happy with some of the guests that we've got. So you included. Wonderful, Cory. Thank you, man.
All right. God bless you, Ted.